Good evening, everyone. Hello, I hope you can all hear me and see me all right. Welcome to our series that we're going to be running. I hope everyone's been able to tune in all right. And it's really great to have everyone joining us tonight. So what we're going to be looking at is this series, Hope in Troubled Times. So my name's Michael. I'm going to be introducing you tonight, and I'm going to be introducing you to our speaker, Robbie, who's going to be joining us in a few seconds. And I'm coming at you live from Caves Beach in Lake Macquarie, just up the road from where we often meet. And I'd just like to, just share a little bit about myself. So I'm Michael. I live in Caves Beach, and I'd just like to welcome everyone here. So I was talking with a friend a few weeks ago, and he was telling me about a story about, they interviewed some people who were older and nearing the end of their life, and they interviewed them and asked them, what would you have changed if you could have changed something about your life? And one of the top answers that was given was they wish they could have done something more that would have mattered. And that's kind of a confronting thing because for us, we sometimes feel like we've got to try and make the most of life, and we've got to try and, make the most of it. And one of the reasons for that is because life is so short. And it can be challenging for us, especially in these days, when COVID's really taken over our lives, and maybe we don't have as much time to do all the things that we want to, and maybe we're not allowed to because of the restrictions. A lot of the things that we like to do, like visiting friends and family, or maybe traveling, or maybe, going out to the movies, or, going out to dinner or something like that, those things we can't do. And it can be really challenging for us, stuck at home and maybe feeling depression and anxiety of maybe not being able to do the things we like, but also just being not sure about what's going to come in the future. And it can be a really challenging thing, living and experiencing that. And what we really need now is we need hope. And so what we're going to be looking at for the next 4 sessions is, where we can find a source of hope and where we can find a hope in this troubled time. So that's something we're going to be looking at over the next few nights. And what I want to do is I want to introduce Robbie, who's going to be speaking with us. So I'd just like to welcome him. Normally I'd say welcome him onto the stage, but I'm going to welcome him onto the screen. Hey, Robbie. Welcome.
How are you? Nice to see you, man.
I'm great. Yeah, it's good to see you as well. We haven't seen each other for a while in person, so it's good to see each other at least online. So yeah.
Right, man. That's right.
So I wanted to ask a couple of questions, maybe before, for people that don't know you, just before you kind of get into it, just so people can get to know you a bit more. So maybe, first of all, maybe just tell us, a brief bit about yourself. You can introduce yourself and maybe a bit about, who you are. So
Yes, sweet. Well, my name's Robbie. For those that don't know me, thanks for having me here. I'm super excited to share with you about hope. I grew up in California. That's where my funny accent comes from. And I currently live like 5 kilometers from Michael in Nord's Wharf, Lake Macquarie. And
awesome.
Love lots of things.
Awesome. Yeah. So, I was going to ask you about your accent. So you've come from California. How long have you been in Australia for?
12 years.
12 years. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So, a lot of people online, they might not be from around our local area. So, so welcome to everyone who's maybe not in our local area. There might be some people from California, so who knows?
Hey, big shout out.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you maybe some of your hobbies outside of work. Do you have some things you like to do?
Yeah, man. I like to write music, play guitar. I love to surf and rock climb and go camping. Anything outside is a good thing.
Yeah, awesome. Well, you live in a good part of the world to be able to do a lot of those things. So yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask you as well, during lockdown, how have you been spending your time?
Well, I work as a church pastor currently, so I've been doing a bit of pastoral care visitation and things of that nature. And outside of work, I suppose I've been doing a little bit of DIY, practicing some camping skills, making some stoves and whatnot, kind of, trying to fill the boredom with something enjoyable.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for that. So I'll ask you a couple more questions as we move through the other sessions, and hopefully we'll get to know you a little bit better. But that's pretty much everything for me. I'm just going to hand over to Robbie now and, let him share the message that he has for us tonight. So thanks, Robbie.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. Well, yeah, I'm super stoked to be here with you guys and super excited to share on this topic of hope. Tonight, we're talking about a trustworthy source of hope. Now, hope is a word that is full of meaning, right? The Cambridge Dictionary defines hope this way. It says, hope is to want something to happen or to be true, and usually to have a good reason to think that it might come true. Notice the emphasis there isn't just on wishing or wanting, but it's on having a good reason to believe that it could happen. Let me share with you a couple of interesting quotes about this idea of hope that I've come across recently. Here's one from Desmond Tutu. Now, he was a South African human rights activist. He was a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and he went on to be the first Black African bishop of Johannesburg. Writing from that period of apartheid, he said about hope, hope is being able to see that there is light despite all of the darkness. And you would need that writing from the circumstances, living in the circumstances that he came through. Another quote about hope that I really like is by the famous Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky. And he writes this, and I want you to keep in mind that he wrote this as a person who had been imprisoned for multiple years in a Siberian labor camp and had come through that and went on to be this great world-renowned author. He said, to cease to hope is to cease to live. Just these are some really powerful words, because what they're trying to convey is that hope is incredibly important. It's a very powerful thing. The truth is that modern medical science and research is actually showing the very same thing. Interestingly, recent research in the last 10 to 20 years on the ideas of hope and resilience show that hope is an essential quality for health, for vitality and wellness, to cope with and recover from illness, and most importantly, to have resilience in times of distress, right? One of the research studies that I looked at recently went so far as to say that hope is the central tenet in recovery from mental health illness. That is just a huge, huge concept, that without hope, the idea of recovering from mental health is too much of a challenge to take. So hope sounds like, to me, it's a pretty important thing. It's a pretty important thing for humanity, whatever your circumstance is. And we live in some crazy circumstances right now, don't we? So one of the things that comes to my mind when we talk about hope is that hope is important. But what about hope being based in reality? Because you don't want false hope that's just a pipe dream, because that doesn't get you anywhere. Hope that is really meaningful is hope that is based in fact and in reality. Now, for more than 2 millennia, multiplied millions of people have looked for their source of hope in an ancient text called the Bible. And this begs a question for me, because when I look at the idea of the Bible, I want to know, not only is this book giving people hope, are they looking and finding promises of life and prosperity or whatever other things they're finding there? But the real question is that hope founded in reality? Is there any evidence to suggest that this book that so many people have found to be a source of hope for their future, is it reliable? Is it a trustworthy source of hope? So tonight we're going to look at briefly 5 lines of evidence, 5 points of evidence that will help us to determine whether or not the Bible is a reliable and trustworthy source of hope. Those 5 things that you can see on the screen that we're going to look at, those 5 pieces of evidence, are manuscript evidence, which is looking at the question of, is the Bible that you can access today, is it the same as the Bible that was written 2,000 plus years ago, or is it just Chinese whispers? The second thing we're going to look at is there any archaeological evidence that has been dug up from the ground that proves the biblical record to be reliable, or the opposite? The third thing we're going to look at is there any evidence outside of the Bible or extra biblical by other historians who are not believers in what the Bible has to say? The fourth piece we're going to look at is internal consistency. Does the message of the Bible match with itself, or does it conflict too much and make itself irrelevant? And the last thing that we're going to look at, point number 5, is briefly, is there any evidence to show that the Bible is anything more than just a human history book? So without any further ado, we're going to jump right in and look at that first point, which is the manuscript evidence. Now, prior to the invention of the computer, prior to the invention of the Gutenberg printing press, if you were going to copy something and keep records long-term after a document would perish from erosion or from degradation of time, you would have to pass those copies on by your handwriting, right? So these would have to be handwritten documents. So when we look at any book of ancient antiquity, We're not talking about something that was printed on a printing press. We're talking about handwritten copies. Now, the obvious question is, how do we know that the copies of the copies of the copies actually match the original writing of the author? To answer that question, we have to look at basically what do historians use to gauge this on any historical work, whether that be Aristotle to Herodotus to Shakespeare to the Bible. Well, these are the two basic questions that they ask. Number one, how many copies are there? Because the more copies there are, the more copies we have to compare to see if they match up. Is the copy that's 100 years later or 500 years later or 1,000 years later, is it worded the same? Does it match the older copies? That's test number one. Test number two asks the question, how long after the original was written is the copy that we have? How old is that copy? How much further after that time was it written? So let's look at a couple of historical examples and let's include the Bible in that list. Now, don't get too caught up and scared by this table. I'll explain it to you really briefly. It's very simple. Looking at some ancient historical works. Now, mind you, I've only picked works here that are considered to be reputable by all scholars across the board. The first is the Roman historian Tacitus, and his book, Annals of Imperial Rome, was written in about AD 116. There is only one copy in existence, just one copy, and that copy was written over 700 years after the original. So this is a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy over 700 years later. But here's the point. All scholars, all historians, liberal and conservative, secular and religious, all agree that what we have written down in that copy matches the original because it matches history, and they consider it to be accurate. Well, let's look at another one that they consider to be accurate. For example, we have Josephus, the famous Jewish historian of the first century. He wrote his book, The Jewish War, in about AD 75. Now, there are 9 copies in existence of this. Now, that's significantly more than one copy. We should be able to then compare and contrast. Does it match up? And what they have found is that those 9 copies are reliable, and they believe them to be exactly accurate to what was written in the original text. Now, the copies that we have, the oldest copies that we have, were written over 800 years after Josephus wrote the original. But nobody doubts or asks the question, is that any different than the original? All historians are agreed. Josephus's works that we have today match what he wrote in the first century. Well, how does the Bible compare to that? When you look at the writings of the New Testament, for example, they were written between 50 and 80 AD, roughly. The oldest copies that we have of Greek manuscripts, which is the original language the New Testament was written in, the oldest copies that we have were written within 50 years. I've got 80 plus years for the average, but the oldest copy that we have was written in 130 AD, and I believe it's the book of John. And this piece of papyrus actually goes back so far that there would be people alive who had been with some of the disciples of Jesus to be able to verify against them and their enemies whether those things were true. This is insane. In terms of historical documents, we're talking within less than 100 years of the original, we have copies that we can test against the copies that we have from later, and we can see if they're reliable and accurate. But not only that, check out how many copies there were. In the Greek, in the original language, we have 5,856 copies. If you add in the other translations of Egyptian and Coptic and Latin and you name it, check this out. When you add up all those different copies of the manuscripts that we have from antiquity, you have a total of 23,986 copies. Now, that's a lot of manuscripts to be able to look at and check and see, does it match up? Are the copies from the earliest period matching with the ones that are from the latest period? This tells us whether or not they're accurate. And this is what they say. The scholar Craig Blomberg, who was the former research fellow of Cambridge University, he said this: 97 to 99% of the New Testament can be reconstructed beyond any reasonable doubt. What does that translate to? The Bible that you can get for yourself in your hands off of the shelf of a bookstore today is 97 to 99% accurate to what was written in the original context. To put that into perspective, the number of copies of manuscripts that we have for the number 2 most documented book of all of ancient history is Homer's Iliad, which has 643. 23,000 and change, 600 and change. There is no reasonable reason to believe that the Bible we have today is any different than the Bible that was written 2,000 years ago. Mind-blowing. Point of evidence number 2 that we're going to look at, the archaeological evidence. Does the Bible match the biblical record? Does the biblical record match what we've been able to find in archaeology? You know, up until recently, the last couple of 100 years or so, there was very little evidence that we had outside of the Bible or written records to support many of the things that the Bible included, including names of people and places and events. But in the last 200 years, there has been an overwhelming amount of archaeological discoveries that corroborate the names of people and places and events that are recorded in the Bible, anywhere from the Old Testament through the New. Let's take a look at 2 quick examples because we've only got so much time. The first that we're going to look at is called the Tel Dan Stele. Now, this dates back to about 850 BC. Now, up until this was found, there's a character in the Old Testament referred to as King David. Many people have heard of King David, but there was zero evidence for King David outside of the Bible and outside of Jewish or Christian writings. There was no evidence for David outside of Scripture. Now, check this out. This is amazing. In 1993, they discovered this piece of stone from what's within the biblical city of Dan in Palestine. And what they discovered was that this stone had written on it, by the way, it was written by a king of an enemy country who had taken one of the kings of the nation of Israel captive. And it says on there the words, the house of David, writing about one of these kings. This kings who descended from the line of David. It was 120 years after David is supposed to have lived. And this is the first corroborating piece of evidence to confirm that. And what this confirms is that David was a real person who really lived 3,000 years ago. But this evidence was only found 20 years ago. Crazy. Let me give you one more example because there are so many we could be here all night. The second one is called the Pilate Stone. Now, there's a person of Roman history who was called Pontius Pilate. You may have heard of him. He's the person who is attributed to actually putting Jesus Christ to death in the 1st century. He reigned in the region of Judea of Israel, modern-day Palestine, from the years 26 to 36 AD. Up until 1961, we had no evidence for him outside of historical written works. This was the first discovery they found that confirmed Pilate's existence outside of history books. Check this out. Not only did it identify that Pontius Pilate lived, it identified that he was working in Judea, just as it says in the Bible. It also says that he was the prefect, which is a position of leadership in the Roman rule, and that indeed was his position in that place. Crazy. Other ancient historians mention many other of these things, but also the archaeology is backing it up. And there have been so many finds over the last decade, the last 100 years, the last 200 years that confirm the places, the people, and the events of the Bible that it's overwhelming. Point of evidence number 3, extra biblical historical writings. What do people have to say who are not followers of the Bible that wrote in history? Is there any evidence to say that the Bible was confirmed by those historians or that people like Jesus really lived? Again, we don't have time to go into too much detail, so let me share with you one. This is from the Jewish historian Josephus, who again lived in the 1st century. Check this out. This is a quotation from his book called Antiquities of the Jews, which was written about AD 93. In this writing, there's this little line that he says that reads like this. So he, speaking about one of the Jewish leaders of the time, assembled the Sanhedrin, which was their basically the Jewish court system of the time. It said he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought them before the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. He delivered them to be stoned, which was the death penalty. Notice what this confirms. This is pretty crazy to think about. Why is this so important? Well, it's important, number one, because Josephus was a Jewish person, not a Christian person. And there was a lot of antagonism between these two groups of people at this time of history. If Jesus wasn't a real historical person, he had no reason to say that he existed, because it would not be for his benefit. He did not have any kind of connection that was positive to Christians. So this speaks well of this being an accurate historical thing. Second point is, it not only mentions Jesus, but another person from the New Testament writing period, the person named James, who's allegedly the brother of Jesus. Thirdly, the most important perhaps fact is that Josephus was born within 5 to 10 years of the death of Jesus. So this means that he was alive and could speak to real life witnesses who saw the events and could tell him whether they were true or false. And he attests to the historicity, I should say, that Jesus was a real person. Now, we don't have time to go into great detail on all of this because I'm conscious of the time. But there are many other historians who verify the same thing. Let me name just a few for you that you could go and explore. One of those is Suetonius, who also references that Jesus was a real person that lived in the first century. Another Roman historian, Pliny the Younger, and also Tacitus, who we mentioned earlier. None of these people were kindly towards the Christian movement. They had no bias, no reason to support the idea that Jesus lived, except to state that it was historical fact that they knew and recognized. So far we've looked at 3 points of history. And by the way, just in case you're wondering, man, this is so much information, I've got so many questions. You can not call in. You can follow the link that'll be popping up on your screen in a moment, and you can fill out just a quick internet form, and you can get a free copy of this book called More Than a Carpenter that's going to actually give significantly more detail on these questions and more. And we have that on offer for free tonight. If you follow the link that's on your screen, it'll pop up in the comments as well, and we'll talk about that again later. Point of evidence number 4. Sorry, I'm feeling really parched. What about the Bible itself? We've looked at evidence outside of the Bible. What about the evidence internally? Isn't the Bible just a book that's full of contradictions? Well, what's interesting is that there's an incredible amount of consistency between the different books that are within the Bible. Check this out. For example, in the New Testament, we have the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each of these books outlines the life and the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, what's interesting is that each of these accounts talks about many of the same stories, but some of the details seem to be different in these stories. Now, at first glance, we might think to ourselves, aha, that must mean that it's not accurate. But what's really interesting to note is that the differences, the so-called inconsistencies, when you read them carefully, you find that what they are actually demonstrating is that these are two different people who witnessed the same event from a different perspective. And so some of the details that they include sound slightly different. Let me give you a modern day illustration. If you and I were both standing on two opposite sides of the street and a car accident took place in between us, we would both be able to tell you a car accident happened. However, the details you would see on the driver's side of the vehicle would give you information that I couldn't see on the passenger side of the vehicle. We might have a lot of the same information, but a couple of extra details from our perspective that would be different. What's interesting to note is that those differences actually work together and give the whole picture more clearly. This is actually what courtrooms do when they bring in eyewitnesses for evidence. If everybody tells exactly the same story with exactly the same details, that usually means that they've colluded together. When there are slight differences, but the same overarching story, what that means is that this is most likely to be true because they are speaking from two different vantage points that they saw as individuals. There are an incredible amount of texts that harmonize just like this all throughout the Bible text. It's amazing. So let me give it to you this way, and you can bring that slide back up on the screen because now I'm ready to say it. Put it this way. The Bible is a book that was written over 1,500 years in 66 different little books within it by approximately 39 different people who lived on 3 different continents, who wrote in 2 testaments, the Old Testament and the New Testament, But the reality is that when you study this book, you see one unified message from start to finish. And that message is that there is a God who made the world, who loves broken humanity and is working to give us hope for change and reconciliation. And that message comes clear through every book of the Bible. It's incredible. So when we compare the Bible to other historical works, the Bible is confirmed to be credible, consistent, and cohesive. But all of that's well and good. But there's one last piece of evidence that we must look at, because the reality is we were talking about hope, not just history, but something that gives us hope for a future, something that gives us a reason to have resilience in times of distress, something that gives us the ability to move forward because of what we're anticipating. And the question is, not only is the Bible an accurate book of history, but is there any evidence to suggest that it is anything more than just a book of human history? This is our last point. The Bible makes some pretty big claims. I've been reading it myself for at least the last 16 years. Now, some of the claims that the Bible makes are like this. This is how big they are. 2 Timothy in the New Testament claims that all of Scripture, all of the Bible, the whole thing is divinely inspired by God. Now, that's a huge claim. Let's be honest about that. That is no minor claim, small claim. The reality is that's probably the biggest claim I've ever heard, and big claims require big evidence. One of the ways that the Bible gives as its own test to say you can check whether this is divinely inspired comes from an Old Testament book called Isaiah. And in chapter 46, it says that God is speaking and says, "There is nobody like me who declares the end from the beginning, and from way back in ancient times, things that have not yet taken place." What's the evidence that it's suggesting we test it by? The Bible claims to be telling the future. And so if we live years later, which we obviously do, the Bible was written between 2,000 and 3,500 years ago, we can look back and check it against real history and ask the question, do any of those predictions, or all of them, or none of them, come true? This is what's called a prophecy, something that's foretelling future events. A word we might use for it today is prediction. Now, the Bible is full of literally hundreds, if not thousands, of prophecies about future events. Now, the question is, do those prophecies come true? Can we check it against history? And the fact is, we can check it against history. So tonight, I want to look at just briefly one of the hundreds of prophecies. There are many more like it. I want to look at just one of those prophecies tonight with you. That prophecy is found in an Old Testament book called Daniel. Now, in the book of Daniel, chapter 2, a vision was given that claims to tell the future history of the world from the time of the Babylonian Empire in the 6th and 7th century BC all the way to the end of the world. So mind you, this is written 2,500 years ago. This is the vision that was given to Daniel, it says. He saw a statue, and that statue was made up of different kinds of metal. The head was of gold, the chest and arms were of silver, the belly and thighs of the statue were made of bronze, its legs were made of iron, and then it had feet that were partly iron and partly clay. Now, this statue was made up of these different metals, and then it says a rock came and destroyed it. Now, if that's all you had, that would be totally useless and meaningless. But then it tells what it means right after, and this is what it says. It says that the head represents the empire of Babylon. It then goes on to say that after Babylon, the next metal on the statue, the chest and arms of silver, represents another kingdom or empire that will take over and destroy Babylon and replace it. It then says after that, there will be another kingdom. And then it says after that, there will be a fourth kingdom, just in case the number was obscure. Babylon, then number 2, then number 3, then number 4. Now, you would expect that empire would be taken over by another, but it in fact says that there will be a change at this point in history. It says that the fourth kingdom, the fourth empire, will be splintered apart and divided into many different groups that will be some strong, some weak, and they will no longer be united until the end of the world when God establishes his kingdom. That's the prophecy. Babylon, then number 2, number 3, number 4 empire, and then that one's going to split, and then it will never be connected together totally under one banner again until the end of the world. Well, we should be able to check that against history because that's 2,500 years ago that started. And we do know, in fact, what happens. And the question is, does history match this or does it disprove the Bible? Well, let's check it against history. And if you're not a history student, I encourage you to go check this out after. Don't just take my word for it. So here's the timeline of history. Babylon ruled from 605 to approximately 539 BC. And in 539 BC, there was a man by the name of Cyrus the Persian, who had united two kingdoms, the Medes and the Persians. They united their forces and they took out the kingdom of Babylon, which was the world empire of the time. And in 539 BC, it says in history, I believe it's Herodotus who records this detail in great detail, says in one night, this just totally unimpregnable city, I got my word wrong, impregnable city that they couldn't conquer, they overcame them in one night. And the Persians took over and all of the Babylonian Empire and spread it. And they reigned for about 200 years until a very famous man named Alexander the Great led the Greeks on an entourage. And in less than 10 years, he took over the entire nation, the entire empire of Persia, and expanded its borders. And the Greek empire totally replaced Persia. After that, they ruled for another almost 100 years. Over 100 years, 331 to approximately 168 BC, 150 years or so, until the Roman Empire hit the stage and conquered all of Greece, all of the Greek Empire, and replaced them. Now, Rome was different. Rome crushed them, and it said in the statue's picture that it would be like iron, and it said it would crush the others. And that's exactly what Rome did. They crucified whole towns of people who rebelled against them. They were an iron-fisted group of leaders, and they reigned for a long period of time, from 168 BC to 476 AD. Now, if we were looking at this, we would expect that an empire would replace Rome. But what's amazing is that it doesn't. No empire took over Rome. But by 476 AD, Rome splintered apart and was taken over by all of these different Germanic tribes. All of these, as the Romans called them, barbarians. And they took over and conquered them and divided them. But not one empire, but numerous little groups, little kingdoms, little tribes. And what's fascinating is that from that day forward, the area of the Western Roman Empire was never united again. And those tribes grew into what we know as modern-day Europe. Now think about this from history. Last point briefly. Many people have tried to unite Europe over the centuries that ensued. It's been 1,500 years since Rome fell. And in that 1,500-year period, Charlemagne tried to unite all of Europe and failed. Louis XIV tried and failed. Napoleon Bonaparte tried and failed. Kaiser Wilhelm in World War I tried and failed. Adolf Hitler, World War II, tried and failed. No one has been able to unite the kingdoms of Europe into one empire successfully ever since that time. This is just one prophecy of hundreds in the Bible that have come true and can be checked against factual history. Mind-blowing. This is just one. There are literally hundreds. The more I have studied them, the more I become convinced that the evidence is overwhelming, that the Bible is more than just some human history book. Because nobody could predict and forecast these kinds of events to happen exactly as they've happened, that far in advance, over millennia. But that's exactly what the Bible does. In John 14:29, Jesus says the reason for these predictions given in the Bible, he says, I've told you these things before they happen, so that when they do, you might believe. And so the fifth test, the fifth point of evidence, is that there is prophetic evidence that goes beyond human reasoning, that we can check against history, that matches the historical record, that proves and demonstrates that there's something more to the Bible than just this, than just human history. It claims to be the Word of God, and I am persuaded that that is the case. In my own life, in my own study of the Bible, I have found it not only to be accurate and reliable and trustworthy, but I found it to be the source of hope that has literally changed my life. It's given me victory over addictions in my past. It's given me the hope that I have needed to overcome mental health difficulties with depression, anxiety, and suicidality. And without the words of this book, I would not be here today. But this book has changed my life, and I believe that it is reliable and trustworthy enough to give you the hope that you need to get through the craziness of the world that we live in. There's an overwhelming amount of evidence to suggest that the Bible is a trustworthy source of hope. The question I have for you today is, would you like to learn more about the hope that the Bible can offer to you in this crazy time we live in this crazy world? I have found the voice of the Bible to be the voice of God to my soul. It has changed everything for me. And the question is, will you come and see what the Bible can do for you? If you would like to respond to that question tonight, I invite you to follow the link that's coming up on your screen in a moment. If you'd like to learn more, follow that link, www.tinyurl.com/hope-step-1. If you follow that link, you'll find a response form, and there you can ask questions. You can leave us a detail for a chat if you'd like to discuss this more. You can also click the link and you can tick that you would like a free resource. There's two things we're offering tonight, and that's this book, More Than a Carpenter, which goes in great detail, much more detail about the points of evidence for the Bible that we've looked at tonight. And you can also see more detail on that prophecy that we've looked at in a link that will send you to a free documentary you can watch online that goes for about half an hour that outlines in greater detail the history of that Daniel 2 timeline. And so I encourage you, friends, to check that out. And lastly, thank you for joining. We're going to be here tomorrow at 2 p.m. to look at our next topic, which is hope for a troubled world. What hope can we find in this ancient book for the troubled world that we live in? So if you'd like to join us then, we'll love to see you then. Have a wonderful night. Thank you for joining. Goodbye.